Hey everyone, and welcome to our study session for your Politics 1500 midterm exam. Today we're going to go over some of the maybe more difficult questions, and I'm going to try to not give you the answers, but give you some hints which will help you as the need may arise. Okay, so looking at the screen here with me, you'll see that we have the midterm exam preparation guide up and running. This is the same midterm guide that you have in your Blackboard file storage right now. You'll see that the study guide is for a multiple choice exam, and that you have to book your exam in the testing center, and there's a slot indicated here that you should use for making your arrangements. We can also make a phone call if needs be to book in there with Julie Rosenbauer is the name of the contact. She's going to be expecting you guys, and she'll have a list of students who are coming. And it'll be a closed book exam, so you shouldn't have anything on the table with you except maybe some blank paper if you need. But certainly no notes taken in with you or anything like that. I'm suggesting 90 minutes to take the exam, but don't try to take the exam any closer than 2 hours from the end of the working day, just in case things go wrong, and sometimes that can happen. So here's a list of all the material that's going to be on your exam, or that you're expected to be reasonably familiar with. The introduction, various chapters here, how to begin to think about the world, where we talked about torture. That was the class you guys said you liked, so I'll be expecting great things. What happens if we don't think in human terms? That's to do with climate change. I think it's a very important topic. And then we also had a session on feminism. How do religious beliefs affect politics? How do we obey, or why do we obey? How do we find out what's going on in the world? And accompanying each of those chapters, of course, were several chapters from the reader. The focus for the midterm exam is less on the chapters from the reader, but they'll make an appearance. And that's and so will some of the lectures. So if you need refreshers, you can always go back and rewatch the lectures. They're posted in your syllabus, and you'll be able to rewatch them if you need to catch up on certain aspects of them. Fast forward, rewind to find the bit that you need. So moving on, I've highlighted the questions that I think perhaps deserve further reflection on my part to help you with your efforts. And the first question, I think, that was really like a pivot question for the entire semester, and will remain a pivot question for the rest of the semester to come, is what is unconscious ideology? We've talked a little bit about that in relationship to some examples like phrenology in our first lecture. So go back to that first lecture if you want some more information on it. But basically it's the distinction that we've drawn, or that I drew. It's not in your textbook, but it is in the lecture, between ideas that we know we have and ideas that we're maybe not aware that we have, right? And so sometimes we can attach the word isms, the idea of an ism, like a communism or capitalism, can be attached to what we call conscious ideologies. But unconscious ideologies generally are, as the expression goes, they're political ways of seeing the world that we're not necessarily conscious of. And this is a class where we've really tried to understand where those ideas come from, why they matter, how they shape our politics. And every single one of the chapters that we've looked at this semester has been an exercise in trying to understand the power of subconscious ideologies. I mean, after all, what is ticking time bomb scenario if not a subconscious ideological frame? Obviously, ticking time bomb scenario itself is a conscious ideological frame, but as we know from thinking about Stephen Colbert's truthification, there can be a number of different dynamics which shape and mold our unconscious or subconscious ideologies over time. Usually they're habitual. And so if we see torture legitimized on the television enough, in TV shows, usually through the ticking time bomb scenario or in Batman movies, eventually it'll rub off on us, and the theory goes that we are primed subconsciously to subsequently, when the news presents us with a rationale that somebody had to be tortured, or when Dick Cheney presents us with a rationale that we had to torture someone, we already kind of subconsciously get it, and so that's why unconscious ideologies and unconscious ideological formation is very important. Now, in that lecture and in chapter 2 of your textbook, the important thing to know is that people like Gramsci, discussed here, Antonio Gramsci defined that as common sense, right? Common sense not being what Thomas Paine described it as, which is kind of like the wonderful repository of knowledge of the masses that had to be trusted and could be trusted if we were going to have virtuous outcomes in our politics. He was a believer in the power of the people. That's not to say we're not, or that Antonio Gramsci wasn't, but he understood that subconscious ideological formation had gone on, and that's why instead of rising up and overthrowing the powers of monarchical domination that beset them, the masses in World War I went to war with each other and did exactly the wrong thing from his point of view. They engaged in a jingoistic war with each other and failed to rise up against their overlords, which were subjugating them. In the first lecture, we also talk a little bit about things like the prisoner's dilemma. It's a scenario of thinking often used in international relations to model anarchy, which, as you know from discussing with me, is the type of context that nation states find themselves in. It's characterized by lack of government, and so there's no laws, there's no punishment for wrongdoing. It's simply the strong doing what they can, and the weak surviving what they must. The prisoner's dilemma models that by taking two prisoners in a context where they're not obliged to trust each other, and where in fact mutual betrayal may actually be an advantage for them. Or well, maybe not mutual betrayal, but at least each one has a motivation to betray the other in the prisoner's dilemma. But the thing about the prisoner's dilemma, just like taking time bomb scenario, is it's just a scenario, right? It's a figure of thought. It's not real, and so we shouldn't invest it with the credibility of being real, and is the point. So why shouldn't we do that? Well, we shouldn't do it because it gives us, historically non-specific assumptions. In taking time bomb scenario, the idea was that the person is actually guilty, that there actually is a bomb, that the bad guy tells the truth. We don't know if ever we were in a situation where we had to torture someone, whether those things would actually be true. There's no way of knowing with certainty. So similarly, prisoner's dilemma has two individuals in prison being interrogated by the police, and we don't know that actual international anarchy is like that. Two relative strangers detained, put into prison with each other, each accused of being complicit in a crime, each given an incentive to betray each other. How realistic is that? First of all, are states people? We've challenged that assumption in class. Are they guilty? Perhaps they're best friends. Perhaps they didn't do anything at all. Perhaps they both believe in democracy and see in each other the potential for a future relationship based on solidarity and trade. As close to being friends as nation states can get. In that case, prisoner's dilemma, while it does define what we've called the statesman's gaze, the gaze of people like Henry Kissinger, the so-called realists, as we described in our first lecture, the prisoner's dilemma is a central sort of framing for the sort of game theoretic mindset of a lot of our foreign policy advisors who've been trained as realists. But it doesn't necessarily maintain for us in the real world, right? And I think it's increasingly the case in conditions of globalization that, in fact, it's highly unlikely that the prisoner's dilemma holds. It's just a model of thought. Then, at the end of the day, it's historically inaccurate. It's completely abstract. It has no concrete purchase on the way the world actually works. So moving forward then, we've just now, in the course of this video, already described two types of abstract thought scenarios, which can lead to, perpetrated over and over and over again, can lead to a kind of subconscious ideology or a way of expecting the world to operate. And this is important because Veronique Pinfat, in fact, says that, basically almost any ethical scenario that we care to mention. In class we talked about the difference between Charles Bates and Michael Walzer's communitarian versus cosmopolitan theories, and Veronica Pinfat draws attention to the fact that both of these theories are just theories. Neither of them are going to be true all of the time. We're just not really the kind of creatures that ever look at the world the same way all the time. Usually there's historical circumstances poking us or prompting us, pushing us in one direction or another direction. So, question 9. In asking us to reflect on how we might begin to think about the world, Pinfat discusses something called the correspondence theory of truth. What is this? Well, it's an idea that somehow our theories describe the world in some form of accurate way. And in our first lecture, we said that maybe there was some sort of hope for that being true in the world of hard sciences, but in the world of human relations and social relations, it seems to be kind of a far-stretched imagination. Because we don't know if our subconscious ideologies are present in our minds or not when we're thinking about the world. Possibly they are, and we just aren't aware. The phrenologists, as I once said, didn't exactly go around thinking of themselves as racists in the sense that we use the word today, at least. They thought they were being scientific. Of course, they weren't. So Pinfat then discusses Ludwig Wittgenstein's criticism of the idea that theories can ever really give us a true picture of the world. Despite these flaws, however, human beings seem frequently to believe in and to become captive to pictures of truth. And while this doesn't mean that we should interpret Wittgenstein as having argued that there's no ultimate truth or reality out there, it is to suggest that our truths are perpetually regulated by so-called language blank, right? I'm not going to give you the answer, but it's an important question. These are all linked, right? So, we are constantly beholden to the language structures that we find ourselves in. The language gives us certain concepts. The language habitually introduces these concepts to us through discourse, so we don't have a choice really as social creatures other than to be sort of perpetually immersed in it. And of course, question 11 here is our ticking time bomb scenario question, so we've already answered that quite a bit today. Moving on, we have question 15, which I wanted to spend some time with you on, which is moving on to the question of the environment. In our module on climate change, we asked about what happens when we don't think in human terms. Our key example for this module was the so-called environment, which, as Simon Dalby argued in our reading, is often used as a category wherein we can lump together pretty much any non-human aspect of our existence. But what did the term environment originally mean? Today it's this kind of like, we have this habit, and Zizek in the video was talking, we'll get to Zizek in a minute, but when it comes to the environment, human beings have tended to, historically, over the millennia, whether it's Christianity, Marxism, or capitalism, all these ideologies have pretty much tended to situate the environment as something at our disposal, right? In other words, that it's there for us to use as a set of resources and tools at our disposal. And so it basically means the non-human world. But what Dalby is sort of suggesting, that it simply used to mean, the environment used to mean what was around us, right? Or it used to be more about our context, or to use the French word milieu. And that there's things at stake in that, I think, because the move from thinking of merely the things around us to thinking of them as things we can use is a shift, and it it suggests that we have a difficulty seeing our place in this environment, right? Whereas the things around us, for Dalby, I think the human was considered in a way to be part of it, you know. We were in it. It wasn't just outside of us, you know, it was around us, and it was we were immersed in it. It might be an interesting way to put it, if you want the poetic language anyway. I wanted to talk about that anyway, at least, because I think it sets the context for what comes up later on here in question 20, is the Zizek video, where he's, you know, obviously walking around the trash heap, and he's criticizing environmentalists actually for thinking of nature like it's some kind of lofty spiritual domain of perfection, spoiled only by the arrival of mankind. What Zizek sort of suggested was that we, you know, don't think of ourselves as somehow separate from this. We are part of the natural processes in some way as well. You know, so trash and all these things, you know, they are artifactual. You know, rather than flushing, environmentalists in a way also want to flush away the trash. They want to get rid of it like it's not there. In fact, they want to get rid of mankind, period, so that it's really not there. And Zizek saying, you know, that's in a way silly. There's, you know, nature itself is kind of artificial, right? It's not harmonious, it's not balanced, it's totally, constantly upsetting itself. Volcanoes, earthquakes, meteorites from out of the heavens, countless disasters and bloodshed, barbarity. So, you know, there's no pristine, sanctimonious nature that we can sort of identify. So, you know, mankind as a creature that tends to sort of tinker with the environment is also part of the environment. You know, it's a thing that's happening within nature. So that's not to say that we shouldn't be trying to save the planet from global warming, but just that the rationale for trying to do so, I think, for Zizek, is different than what regular environmentalists might put forward. In fact, what he's suggesting is that we kind of increase the artificiality, right? That we take our technology and our science and we accelerate them so that we can get ahead of global warming, we can get ahead of environmental destruction, and try to sort of figure out a way to be human in nature at the same time. So I don't know that I fully agree with him, but I think it's very provocative, and I think it's better in some ways than you know, the Al Gore kind of, you know, oh, nature's so beautiful and we should treasure it always. I mean, I think there's a kind of an assumption in there that we as human beings are bad news for it as opposed to being part of it. What I like about Zizek's formulation is he can still take the problems really seriously. Like, global warming is a real problem for him. It's just that we have a different set of choices, a broader set of tools, maybe in a way, that we can use for dealing with it. So, of course, I think I've probably just answered question 18 as well. You know, the idea of an instrumentalist reading of nature, right? That's what we're trying to get away from in some ways. And of course, I mentioned Christianity and other types of ideology as having fairly instrumentalist viewpoints on the environment. So, moving on, we obviously moved as the semester went by, we moved to talk about feminism. So some of the things that came up, you know, the difference between second wave feminists and maybe more postmodern feminists like Ariel Levy. One of the reasons why Ariel Levy was so important as opposed to the Betty Friedan second wave type was that the location of power was different for female chauvinist pigs, Ariel Levy. So that's something to be conscious of. One was saying there's an overt sort of patriarchy, men, masculinity, are all part of a class structure in a kind of way where men are on top and women are underneath. And of course, women needed to emancipate themselves from the ideology of that structure. But I think looking at the Girls Gone Wild scenario, the focus was on subconscious ideology more than conscious ideology. And of course, subconscious ideology is not necessarily sort of forced on women in a propaganda structure by men, as Betty Friedan might have been arguing. It's more that men and women together are reproducing gendered theoretics of how to behave and how to carry on. And so we have to look to our cultural text, the text being, of course, the ensemble of all the various different stories and media that we have that make comments in some way, shape, or form on this, whether it's fictional TV shows or self-help books. So Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus is an interesting self-help book that sort of presumes that men and women are, heterosexual broadly, and that they have certain problems and that they are of a certain type of nature. And of course, many men will not recognize themselves as a man in this book, and many women will not say they're from Venus, right? Because they just won't have those values. So the problem with the self-help books is they're very normative. They presume who we are and what we stand for, and the problems that we have as a result of that. And of course, if you were, if you have gender curiosity, if you are gay, if you are bi, if you are transgender, it's going to be very hard to recognize yourself in a book like that, right? And yet it sold like hotcakes. It was flying off the shelf, I think, for most of the last decade. So, and they're still around. So, moving on to question 27, Wibben suggests that one possible way out of the dilemma of these static theories is to argue that who we are is always a matter of becoming rather than one of being, right? So why are we so hung up on the idea that we have to be straight, gay, whatever, right? That in fact all of us, no matter what we are dynamic, we are unfolding, we are singular, right? Very, very unique. Like each of us has a unique fingerprint. So too, in a way, our identities are unique. We don't have to be male, female, whatever have you. So this means changing the question of identity away from who we are or have been towards something much more fluid. Okay, so I wanted to focus on that because I think those two questions go well together and they're very related. Someone else to talk about when we're talking about gender, of course, is Bell Hooks. Now, she'd be more of a Marxist feminist, which is another post-second wave position. And her question would be sort of more on the material distribution side of things. How can we allow white feminists to sort of exhort us all to lean in, as the latest sort of popular feminist texts sort of argue, to sort of subscribe to these very white middle class kind of notions of what women are and what they can be and all the rest, and to go beyond that to try to recognize that such careers are really very lofty indeed goals for the perspective of people living in the third world and women struggling in the third world, for whom it would be absolutely lovely to be a Western style housewife. So Bell Hooks, very important criticism of the second wave feminists in that regards. Okay, and there's of course your Girls Gone Wild question, and of course we switched register there. We were referring to liberal feminism versus maybe postmodern feminism, but liberal feminism in a sense here, I think would sort of, the placeholder would be to sort of think about Betty Friedan and the second wave feminists as liberal feminists. So moving on then, we have the question of Hamas and Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda and why they're different. And well, I think without giving you the answer, one important thing to recognize is just that Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden tended to be the ones that wanted a global jihad, right? They wanted to have a global Islamic community. They were pursuing what was called the Ummah, which is the sort of globe-spanning Islamist community. Whereas Hezbollah and Hamas are more state-centric, particularist. They are steeped in a kind of a national culture, and they are sort of a state-focused revolutionary organizations in some ways, right? They aren't exclusively or solely religiously oriented. So, moving on then to the question of why we behave and all the rest, I wanted to draw your attention to a typo that I saw in the prospectus in the study guide, where I referred to chapter 6. Actually, that was chapter 6 in the old edition. This is the second edition that you guys are all using, and it should be chapter 7. So in class 5 on the topic of obedience, we discussed Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt and her reaction to the trial of chief Nazi logistician Adolf Eichmann for war crimes. What famous term did she coin to express her reaction for this trial? I'm not going to give you the answer, but it's a central concept, and if you don't get it, it hampers you, I think, understanding Stanley Milgram's point. And Stanley Milgram, of course, was the guy that set up the experiment that we discussed in class to test just how common it would be for ordinary people to participate in torture were they given the orders from the right people. So moving on from there, obviously we're into the thicket of the module on obedience and legitimate authority and its parameters. And we had the question of theta Scotch-Paul, which is that, when we think about revolution, when we think about disobedience, politically we think about revolution. This revolution is usually against the power of something called the state, and we want to seize the state from the other guys. But of course the state itself has a kind of a power, it has a kind of a logic, and we can call that the logic of sovereignty, if you will. But theta Scotch-Paul arguing that once we've grabbed the instrument of the state, that maybe the state grabs us back, and just as we think we are its masters, in fact we become its servants, because after all we were the ones that believed that this is the thing that has the power, right? And once we have the thing, then we have the power. So the irony then is that even though we might have revolted for democracy or in the name of democracy, the logic of the state requires that we defend what we've gained. And so we may have to decide who our enemies are then, and we may have to start hunting those enemies down, engaging in surveillance, engaging in torture, engaging in prosecutions, or maybe even assassinations to deal with them. And of course, the irony is we've just stopped being democratic, right? We revolted in the name of democracy, and we in defending democracy we became anti-democratic. And it's theta Scotch-Paul says it's the old story, it happens over and over again. This is kind of a classic messed up thing that happens for those pursuing democratic ways of life through violence. It's a paradox. Okay, so moving on then, we have another phantom question 6, or chapter 6 reference, should of course be chapter 7. It's all about obedience and why do we obey, depending on which edition of the textbook you're using. So we discussed in chapter 5, and also it's mentioned in chapter 6, or chapter 7, that Foucault rejects Hobbes's idea of the state being something over us with a life of its own. This is a real tension here, right? So Scotch-Paul arguing that there is such a thing as the state, and it can grab you. The logic of the state can grab you, but don't be deceived. In some ways, even Scotch-Paul is agreeing that I think that the state is a cultural phenomenon as much as anything else. It's not that there's a literal agent or entity called the state that's grabbing your brain and making you anti-democratic if you're an armed revolutionary. No, the nuance that we need for thinking about this comes from Foucault, who said that the thing that we need to sort of get past is the culture of thinking of the state as the scene or the site wherein politics takes place. So what that means is that although we literally chopped the head off the king, during the French Revolution or during the English Revolution, Charles II, we still believe that the state is the place where real politics takes place. You know, this distinction between high politics and low politics, and that if you seek power, you know, that the place you turn to, the site to which you turn, is the site of the state. So Foucault says that we've cut the head off the king. Oh goodness. So Foucault says that we've cut the head off the king literally, but not something else, right? And there's some other way in which we have not cut the head off the king. So, moving on to question 43, the globalization reader Joe Stiglitz argues that countries such as the so-called Asian tigers have prospered in free market globalization, mainly because they were allowed by the West to adapt to it on their own terms and at their own pace. Yet, he notes, in the years immediately preceding the 1997 Asian financial meltdown, the Washington Consensus effectively coerced many of these countries to engage in a harmful reversal of this policy. What exactly was it that the Washington Consensus had the tigers do? I wanted to focus on this question with you because actually the Washington Consensus is a term that only shows up briefly in the excerpt that you read of Joe Stiglitz, although in his wider writings it's a term he uses a lot more than that. But it's this idea, I suppose, that, you know, after the Cold War, nations all over the world embraced the Western style of economic practice, becoming globalized, becoming financialized, and embracing open markets. But in fact, the major financial regulating institutions of the planet, the IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organization, in fact, as Stiglitz recounts to us, they fairly aggressively coerced the tigers to embrace this Western logic of regulation. So the question is, what precise measures did they have the Western, these Eastern tigers, these Asian tigers introduce, and why might that have been harmful, right? Because Stiglitz is saying they weren't really institutionally ready for that yet. They weren't developed enough, and they were being forced to act this way before they were properly ready. So, moving on then. Last couple of questions for you here. We've covered a lot today, guys. So, Stuart Hall disagrees with the optimistic account of pluralism, the talking about media here. He believes that elite theorists too easily forget that audiences have the capacity for what exactly, right? That audiences are basically reflexive creatures. They're capable of making, they're not just mindless robots that can be brainwashed by the ideological machines of Fox News. The pluralists are far too optimistic. You know, obviously they're the ones that believe that in the watchdog theory, people like Jefferson were never alive in our age of corporate media, so they didn't really know what to expect, and they didn't know what was coming down the road. But we certainly are living with it, and we know that pluralism is a bit naive. But should it be as cynical, full-on, as the elite theorists? Stuart Hall believes maybe not quite so much. And so Stuart Hall tries to adopt a middle ground position that actually allows for audiences to interpret and to make their own minds up, recognizing that the media has preferred interpretations, but that the audiences might not necessarily be passively sort of enslaved to that preferred interpretation. So Stuart Hall goes on to talk about the importance, therefore, of emotions. Like, so it's if the mind and heart of the audience at home is not a foregone conclusion, what techniques do media products use to win over these home viewers? It's not just a question of the home viewer being persuaded rationally, just in the mind. There's also the heart. And so the example that we use in the textbook was the Spielberg film Saving Private Ryan, which uses dramatic imagery and stimulating music to produce a sort of an effect in the audience, thus tending to introduce emotions into the mix, right? And so making what would appear to be a good guy bad guy encounter you know, a propaganda effort, if you will, because of course Spielberg's movie didn't really tell us much about the Germans or their history, right? So in a way, it's an abstract reflection of what happened in World War II in its own right, simplified. I mean, so the role of emotions here is very important for Stuart Hall, because he believes that media products have to work, right, to persuade us, right? It's not just a foregone conclusion. The Stephen Colbert effect, to go back to our first lecture, isn't just to do with priests and things telling us what to do, or scientists, people with legitimacy, an aura of legitimacy around them telling us what to do. It's also often to do with emotional factors as well. Powerful music can be just as persuasive and convincing as an argument that, oh, you know, those guys over there are the bad guys. So, and then 50, last but not least, the question that makes me sad, which is about Dallas. We brought it up in relation to the Tomlinson piece in your supplementary readings, and again, this question is a question of interpretation. Tomlinson doesn't think it's complex enough to simply say that the West is a cultural imperialistic power. Rather, it is that there are preferred meanings that the Western media has for how their cultural products should be interpreted, but the reality is that global viewers don't always accept it, and so they can recognize sometimes when they're being sold a seductive image of Western lifestyles, and they recognize it as simply drama. So there you go, folks. I've given you the answers to a couple of these. I didn't mean to do that, but definitely I wanted to help clear up a few things for you in this. And so good luck in the exam. Hope it goes well for you, and I'll be rooting for you. Okay, take it easy. Bye-bye.